In this module we examine the security information that is stored against each file and directory on the system. Let's have a look at what's available. There are three things that are stored against each file and each directory. First is who owns the file. This is always a user ID or a username. We know this simply as the owner of the file. Every file has an owner. There's also a group that file belongs to. And what that means is that all members of that particular group have a particular set of permissions over that file, and no members of any other group have any permissions over that file. And thirdly, there are a set of permissions that various parties have to access the file. We are going to learn more about the permissions in much greater depth in this chapter, including this module. Let's look now at the various permissions that are attributable to any given file or directory. And there are three sets of these. Three sets of permissions against each file. Let's have a look at what each of the three is. First, there are the access privileges of the owner of the file. What is the owner allowed to do to the file? Well, you would assume that the owner is allowed to do anything, and strictly speaking that is true, assuming that they know how to. Secondly, there are the access privileges of the members of the file's group. In other words, if the file is considered to be owned by the sales group, then what are the access privileges of all the users that are members of the sales group? Finally, what are the access privileges of everybody else? So three sets of permissions may be specified here. What can the owner do to the file, what can the members of the group do to the file, and what can everybody else do to the file? It's very important to note that the only person that can change any of these things, and we're talking about the permissions, we're also talking about the owner, and we're also talking about the group. The only person that can change any of the above is the owner. If you're a member of a group that owns the file, it doesn't mean you can change anything. Only the owner can change any of these things. So how do we look at these things? How do we find out what the owner is, what the permissions are, and so on? Well, all of these may be examined using the -L option to the ls program. Let's have a look at that -L option right now. Let's see what happens if we do an ls -L. Well, we get the following. We've briefly had a look at this particular way of using ls before, and I've briefly gone through and told you what some of those things mean, but now we're going to do that in some more detail. Firstly, this column here represents the file's owner. As you can see, every file in this particular directory is owned by me. Now, this column represents the group of the file, so the permissions specified, which I'll show you in a second, pertain to all members of the users group. And thirdly, the permissions themselves are over here. That's what all these R's and W's and dashes and X's are all about. Now remember I said that there are actually three of them. Three sets of permissions for the owner, for the group, and for everybody else. Well, there are actually 10 spaces along here, 10 spots where letters can go. The first one has nothing to do with permissions at all. That's the file type. Notice that D is for a directory and dash is for a regular file. But the other 9 are for the three groups that we were talking about, the three sets of permissions. So the first 3 are for the owner, the second 3 are for the group, and the third 3 are for everybody else. So for example, we have an R, W, and a dash for the owner of this file, which is mvirtue. We have an R, a dash, and a dash for the group called users. And then we have an R, a dash, and a dash for everybody else. Everyone who's not called mvirtue and everybody who's not a member of the users group. I'll be explaining what the R's and W's and dashes and X's and so forth mean in the next module. For now, I just want you to be able to read this ls-l listing. And it's really not that hard when you know what the various components are. The first letter is the file type, and then there are 3 sets of 3. And each one is an R or a dash, a W or a dash, and an X or a dash, depending on whether we call the R is turned on or off, the W is turned on or off, and the X is turned on or off. So we have the R and the W both turned on and the X turned off, whereas here we have the R turned on, the W turned off, and the X turned on. Let's go and examine what those three letters actually mean.